The Capcom Beat 'em Up Bundle. This is a collection of 7 Capcom arcade games. And you might have already guessed, they are all beat 'em ups. I'm going to talk about these games in the order they appear on the selection screen, which I am fairly certain is their chronological order of release. So first we have Final Fight. I remember the first time I encountered a Final Fight arcade machine. I was on what was an undoubtedly terrible vacation as a child to a little town called Morro Bay. And while I had absolutely no interest in any of the sightseeing, I do remember there was an arcade off the lobby of the hotel we were staying at, and there I saw Final Fight. I'd never seen a game that had sprites that were that big and that detailed before. And while the gameplay is very simple in Final Fight, the spectacle of seeing it in action was enough to keep me captivated. And every quarter that I could get my hands on that horrible vacation, I used in that arcade machine. Nowadays playing this, it's a little underwhelming. The beat-em-up genre has never been terribly complex, but this is just so simplistic by today's standards that it's actually hard to go back to Final Fight at this point. Also, as a child, I thought Dan Hagar was actually Jesse Ventura. Moving on, we have King of Dragons. And if I'm being completely honest, I have a lot more experience with the Super Nintendo port of this game than with the actual arcade. But honestly, outside of the arcade version looking a little bit nicer, there's not a huge difference between the two. This game acted as if there is some kind of character progression, and admittedly your health bar or hit points do increase a little bit with every level you gain, but I was never completely sure if the new weapons and other pieces of equipment that you get actually did anything or not. Yeah, they change up the appearance of your character, at least a little bit, but are they actually making you hit any harder or take any less damage? But I guess it doesn't really matter either way, because as I played this, I was always trying to get to the end of the next level, just so I could see what the next piece of gear would be for whichever character I was playing. And that was a nice touch, that each one of the classes you can play as has different gear, and plays slightly differently, at least as differently as you can within the confines of a beat-em-up. Next we have Captain Commando. This was a game I remember playing in the arcade and not really understanding what was going on, because I was never clear on how the characters you could select from were really related to one another. Because you had Captain Commando that looked sort of like a knockoff G.I. Joe, but you could also be a ninja, or a mummy, or a baby piloting a robot. And the enemies were just as diverse. At the end of the first stage, you fight a guy that looks like he's from the Road Warrior. But then the second stage boss is like a guy in scuba gear. And everything's just kinda wacky and strange. And that's not a complaint, I really enjoyed that aspect as a child. Sort of had the same feeling as when you're a child playing with toys that don't quite go together. Moving on, we have Knights of the Round. And this is possibly my all-time favorite beat-em-up. Being a fairly loose translation of Arthurian myth, you can play as King Arthur himself, Percival, or Lancelot. Lancelot is fast, Percival is strong, and Arthur is right in the middle. Of course, when I used to play this in the arcade, I always went with Arthur because after all, he's the king. And I was fascinated by this being a beat-em-up where you could level up, and when you leveled, you got new equipment. And yes, I think most of it is just superficial, as you honestly never really seem any stronger when you get a new sword and start hitting the same enemies. Nonetheless, I spent a ton of time in the arcade, and on the Super Nintendo version, just trying to see what your character would look like with the next level. Would it just be a slightly different weapon, or would you get a whole new suit of armor? And that curiosity just kept me coming back for more and more, quarter after quarter. Up next, we have a game that I was kind of disappointed by back in the day, Warriors of Fate. This is apparently based off of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a famous Chinese novel. However, you wouldn't really know that playing the English version of this game. Most of that was lost in localization. But my disappointment comes from when I first played this in the arcade. I thought it was going to be more like Knights of the Round, with a leveling system, and getting different gear as that happened. There is none of that here, and perhaps it was unfair to go in with those expectations. Nonetheless, that made me avoid this game on my trips to arcades as a kid. And that's sort of a shame, because playing it now, I could see that I would have really enjoyed this back then. But unfortunately, the younger version of me had unrealistic expectations that were based on absolutely nothing. But that's just how things work out sometimes. Now, the last two games in this collection, I had never played before seeing them in this collection. Armored Warriors is a beat-em-up featuring giant robots. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Giant robots make anything better. This is a game I would have went nuts for as a child. You can choose from 4 distinctly different robots, and you can get different guns and arms to put on them to change up how their attacks work. It's apparently some kind of alien invasion going on that the robot pilots have to stop. I honestly don't know how this game went completely under my radar, except for the fact I probably was never in an arcade that actually had one of the cabinets of this. This would have definitely been an obsession of mine, and even now I've spent a lot of time playing it because this is so right up my alley. Finally, we have Battle Circuit. This has that same kind of wacky energy that was in Captain Commando, although to a much greater extreme. I am honestly unclear as to why you fight an Elvis impersonator in this game, or why one of the selectable characters appears to be a plant monster. But I will say it's all very entertaining to look at, and you can get your character's money in this game through doing combos or just picking it up off the ground. And then you can buy various upgrades for your character, in the form of new moves, which does make for some legitimate character progression in this game. This came out in '97, and by that point I had kind of stopped going to arcades, as most of the ones near me had shut down or become very rundown. But this was also only released in Japan and Europe, meaning that even if I had been going to arcades at the time, I would have never encountered this machine. Sitting down to play the beat-em-up bundle really does make one appreciate having some genre diversity in a collection. And yes, these games are varied from one another, but they're variations on a theme, as at the end of the day, these are all beat-em-ups. That's not to say that these aren't quality games. These are all very enjoyable individually. I, however, would not recommend playing them one after the other in the same fashion that I did. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.